Good afternoon. It's a good class to hear about a very important subject. I'm Jane Harmon, the president and CEO of the Wilson Center, and I want to welcome those here physically in the audience as well as those tuning in via C-SPAN and live webcast, all terrific tools for bringing even more people into this critically important discussion. The Wilson Center recently joined forces with NPR to create this public event series we call the National Conversation. Our hope is that this series will provide the public with new opportunities to engage in much-needed civil discourse, let me underline civil discourse, free from spin, imagine that in this election season, in the safe political space that the Wilson Center provides. New York Times reporter Scott Shane, is Scott here? I'm going to out him if he's here. Maybe he's listening in. Anyway, he wrote an article last week about how cyber warfare is just beginning to emerge from the shadows for public discussion by U.S. officials. The lack of public knowledge about cybersecurity is, in my view, truly frightening. In the past 2 weeks alone, the websites of Bank of America, J.P. Morgan, Wells Fargo, U.S. Bank, and PNC have all suffered from, quote, denial of service, end quote, cyber attacks. And apparently that didn't even take much effort on the part of the hackers. Does a cyber 9/11 need to occur before anyone starts paying attention? When I attended the Aspen Security Forum in late July, General Alexander, he'll be introduced and you'll hear from him in a moment, said we need to get the public into the conversation about cybersecurity. I thought that was a magnificent idea, and this national conversation is our attempt to use the convening space of the Wilson Center to do just that. Wilson hosted John Brennan in April, who spoke publicly about guidelines for the U.S. drone program, and we're hoping today, in a similar fashion, to lift some of the fog over cyber, another key tool of both espionage and combat. It's easy for an issue like cyber to become polarized when the public doesn't know the facts. The facts, which will be spelled out much more clearly during today's panel discussion, are that there have been massive foreign intrusions not only into government networks, but also into private networks by governments, companies, and individuals. In the Republic of Georgia, there's an election going on today. There are allegations that there have been cyber attacks between the candidates. Investigators allegedly found 66 malware infections on 5 computers operated by the president's political rival. The clever virus could turn on the computer's cameras and microphones, capture story screenshots every 10 seconds, and record keystrokes and passwords. Anthony, I bet that gives you chills, and I'm with you. Some threats, like the emptying of your bank account or the shutting down of the power grid, are easier to visualize. Others, like the online theft of intellectual property, are harder to wrap our heads around. Cyber doesn't respect nation states, and that's something we need to, but aren't thinking about. The debate, at least as I see it, is taking place at 30,000 feet, and we don't have a way the public can participate. And that's all while, as General Alexander said at that Aspen event, cyber attacks in the U.S. increased 18-fold from 2009 to 2011. And the irony is that a lot of the folks who are doing this, or some of them anyway, are trying to return us to the 7th century caliphate by using the most modern tools. They attack us asymmetrically. We need to be thinking outside the box if we're going to repel those attacks. I'm persuaded that one of the best uses for Wilson's platform is to bring the stakeholders into this conversation. And I'm very excited about doing this today. There's a lot to talk about, including the scope of the problem, the gridlock on Capitol Hill that is preventing a careful legislative response, the limitations of executive action, and the huge consequences if we do nothing. What has to happen is for the public, including advocacy organizations like the ACLU, to agree to help solve the problem. No more time for the blame game, time now to solve this problem. But without a debate in the public square, we won't move forward. And we could easily have, I'm sure Senator Collins will tell you, a devastating attack. My hope is that with clearer understanding of information, answers will emerge. And so we have a terrific lineup for today's event. As I like to tell Steve Inskeep, the host of NPR's Morning Edition, he is the first male voice I hear when I wake up every morning, and we've never even had a fight. He covered deliberations over the Cybersecurity Act of 2012, which is proposed by Senators Joe Lieberman and Susan Collins, and he's moderated several spectacular events here at the Wilson Center. Welcome back, Steve.
Thank you.
In all objectivity, Susan Collins, the ranking member of the Senate Homeland Security Committee, is one of the best legislators who has ever served in Congress. Ever. You can applaud. Go ahead. We bonded, I think this is actually true. It's urban legend, but it's true. We bonded during intelligence reform in 2004, and I have called us ever since the bicameral bipartisan Sister Act. I don't always have warm and fuzzy relations with the ACLU, however, and they have wrongly disagreed with me from time to time. But in Anthony Romero, I found a man with an excellent and open mind who's ready to engage. He and I have had many discussions on this issue, and I think you're going to be impressed with the role he is playing in this panel. He survived testifying before me when I was chair of the Subcommittee on Intelligence, Information Sharing, and Terrorism Risk Assessment, so today should seem like a piece of cake after that. But finally, we're very privileged to have General Keith Alexander, whose insights inspired today's discussion. General Alexander is the director of the National Security Agency, the chief of the Central Security Service, and the commander of U.S. Cyber Command. On a scale of 1 to 10, I think General Alexander's given us a 3 for preparedness for a cyber attack, and he has repeatedly expressed his support for the approval of a comprehensive cyber security bill. He's extremely knowledgeable, but even more important than that, he is the rare technical person who can explain things in English. If we think we need former President Bill Clinton as the Secretary of Explaining Things, I think we need General Alexander as the Secretary of Explaining technical things like cyber. This is an issue I am passionate about. As I have told some of you, I serve on 4 advisory boards for this administration, the Defense Policy Board, the Foreign Policy Board, the CIA External Board, and the DNI's board. And I co-chair the Aspen Homeland Security group with Michael Chertoff, former Secretary of DHS Michael Chertoff. So I'm joining this panel just to make sure that everybody gets everything out. And the goal here, one more time, is to involve you in this conversation. This isn't a conversation to talk at you. This is a conversation to get you and your ideas to the forefront and to make certain that you too want to join us in solving the problem. So please welcome Steve Inskeep and a spectacular panel, and welcome to many of you back to the Wilson Center.
Thanks very much for a powerful introduction. I really appreciate it. A powerful warning as well. In fact, as you were talking, Ms. Harmon, I was looking at the coffee table and trying to think if we could all get under it or if it's just not large enough. So you've laid out some strong problems there, but I want to begin by defining the problem a little bit better if we can, because you spoke of denial of service attacks on banks. You spoke of the possibility of a digital 9/11. You spoke of different possible enemies or adversaries. And I'd like to narrow that down a little bit. If we were going to try to name a central concern that the United States has or should have, what kind of attack are you most concerned about? What kind of enemy or adversary would be behind such an attack? Any of you can start. General, you could start, in fact.
Well, I'm not going to name specific countries because I think in this environment that wouldn't be the appropriate way to handle it. But let me give you the class of attacks that I'm concerned about. I think for the last 10 years, what we've seen on our networks has been essentially exploitation or the theft of intellectual property, crime, those types of events. The Congresswoman pointed out over the last few weeks, we've seen distributed denial of service attacks. So we're seeing the threat grow from exploitation to exploitation and disruption. And my concern is it's going to go from exploitation, disruption, and to destruction. And what I mean by destruction is the physical destruction of computer devices on the network, which would cause these networks to fail. That's my greatest concern. Or the loss of a significant amount of data that would impair our company's ability to operate, the stock exchange, or the power grid. All of that's within the realm of the possible. The consequence means that we have to work together and understand this. And I think, you know, if I were to put one thing on the table, it's education. You know, on cyber, the key thing is understand what's going on in the networks. We've really got to understand that so that we can all get together and come up with a solution that will solve that problem.
Are you suggesting that even the people who run the networks do not fully understand what is happening on their networks?
I think the people who run the networks understand what's happening on their networks given the information they have. The problem is they don't have all the information. Government has some, they have some, academia has some. We're not sharing. Part of the legislation is, why don't we share this data? How does government take classified information and share it with industry so that they can help identify when there's a problem and tell the government? That's part of the solution, I think. It's to address this in such a way that we're transparent in our actions, and I think this really gets to some of the discussion we were having before with Anthony. I think we can solve the civil liberties and privacy concerns and the cybersecurity. The way to do that is transparency. It's by having all of government work together. Now, that doesn't mean just NSA and Cyber Command. NSA, Cyber Command, and FBI. It means DHS with industry. And we know things that they may not know. And we need to share them and say, if this happens on your network, you got to tell us. We don't need to be there to screen traffic. They can tell us. They see the traffic. They can say, I saw a red car going by, and you said if a red car goes by, this is bad. A red car just went by, it's bad, help. And that's where we would come in. And I think in that manner, a couple of things are on the table. One, transparency. You've got multiple organizations working together. I think you've got us working with industry, and a great part of some of the bills that are on there is the information sharing and the liability. We need those. If we don't do that, what I'm concerned about, what's going to happen, and you're seeing this, it's creeping up from, and we made that discussion a year or two ago. We said it's going to go from exploitation to disruption. We're now in disruption, and you're seeing that, to destruction. And destruction could be overwriting data. It could be overwriting the basic input-output of a system, the ability for a system to turn on, which would cause a number of our systems to go down, or any one in between. I believe that's coming our way. We have to be out in front of this for a whole host of reasons. The Defense Department's reason is we depend on critical infrastructure to do our job. We depend on the power grid. We depend on the internet to operate.
Just so that we're clear on our terms, when you talk about disruption versus destruction, the attack on PNC the other day, as we understand it, was just basically flooding their computers with requests. They didn't actually break through a firewall, they just overloaded the system.
That's just a disruption. You know, it's like kids in your car, they're yelling and screaming. I have 4 daughters and 14 grandchildren. They're all in the back. They're talking, we're trying to talk. You can't get a word through. That's disruption. That's a distributed denial of service attack. Now, if you give them weapons, that's a whole different ballgame. We've not done that, not even as a test, but you can see the difference would be, right now, it's once that stops, they can go about doing their job, and the internet service providers can, to a large extent, filter out part of that disruptive traffic. But it does have an impact. It does slow it down. It does impact those companies. And as a consequence, if you think of a company that makes its job on the internet, like a stock market or Amazon or one of those, and somebody impairs the ability for them to get that slows down their business. That has a top-line impact. if you destroy the infrastructure, that company is seriously impacted and probably going to go bankrupt.
Can you, and I want to bring other people into the discussion here, but first let me just ask, can you name a recent instance in which someone has moved to destruction, actually destroyed something?
I think there's been some public ones on that. I think, which one? Yeah, there's Aurora, and then there were some other ones that are out there.
Why don't you explain what Aurora was?
Well, there's, well, let me go to one that I think is more recent, which was Aramco.
Okay.
It was public, and a number of their computer systems lost a lot of data. I think in the press it said 20 or 30,000 lost all the data on their systems. Think about a company that loses all the data on their systems. That doesn't mean you just go to backup, it's gone. And if you lose that data, and that data had important information, you can never recover it. So you'd have to back up. From our perspective, that has a significant problem. The other part, though, is you look at this and you look at the way the network operates. You know, parts of these are routers and stuff that helps traffic go through. Parts of these are systems that tell you how to get from point A to point B, domain name servers. And when you start thinking about how the network is brought together, if you start to wipe out data on there, you wipe out the ability for the network to operate. That's a significant concern. That means that the calls from my kids to us won't come through because it doesn't know how to do it. And most of that is digital today. Now, I could live with that, but my wife couldn't. And so I do think we have to get out in front of it, really for the operation of our government and our country, but it also will have a significant economic impact.
So you named going toward destruction from disruption as being one of the major problems here. Senator Collins, when we were talking about network operators maybe not understanding everything that's going on in the networks, you nodded. You don't think that people know what's going on?
Well, there have been surveys that have shown that 40% of the owners and operators of core critical infrastructure, our financial networks, our water treatment plants, our transportation systems, were not hardening their computer systems sufficiently. In just the past year, over 200 examples of cyber attacks to core critical infrastructure, our national assets, have been reported to the Department of Homeland Security. And that is only the tip of the iceberg. Undoubtedly, there are many more that have not been reported. We have found that some companies don't do such basic steps as changing the default password that comes with the industrial control systems that are used to control the networks.
You mean 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 is not a strong password?
It's not a good one, nor a strong password.
Oh.
Password.
Oh, that's even better.
But you know, if you look at this more broadly, I think there are 3 areas of concern. One is the threat that it poses to our economy, because it is our economic edge, our intellectual property, our R&D that is being stolen. The general memorably has said it's the greatest transfer of wealth in history. It costs billions of dollars and millions of jobs to our country. The second, and to me the most worrisome, is the threat to our core infrastructure. Look what the storm in the Washington, D.C. area in June did to us when it wiped out the electric grid for so many people. Well, multiply that many times if it were a deliberate cyber attack that took out the electric grid for the entire East Coast. And the third area of concern is the threat to our privacy, the ease with which transnational criminal gangs, for example, can steal private information and have done so from numerous organizations and companies.
Although there's different layers of threats there, and I'm trying to figure out as a citizen which one to be more worried about. Should I actually be more worried about general intellectual property theft that transfer of wealth? Should I be more worried about that than a digital 9/11 type attack?
I personally am most worried about an attack on our core critical infrastructure, such as the electric grid, because that could cause a loss of life, destruction of property, a terrible impact on our economy. That cuts across everything. And to me, that is the most serious threat. But I don't in any way minimize the threat to our economy of the continual theft, particularly by China, of our intellectual property and R&D. There's one case where a company lost in 20 hours $1 billion worth of R&D. That has a real impact on our international competitiveness and our ability to create and preserve jobs.
Anthony,
Can
go
I-
ahead, please.
Can I
go ahead,
add to
Jeff.
that? Because I agree 100% with the senator. In fact, I asked our folks to look at this because I agree. Both of these are the issues that we're facing, and we can solve both. I mean, both of these are solvable, and we should put them both on the table. I think the theft of intellectual property is absolutely significant. And you think about what's going on and the way it's being taken, we can and should do everything we can to stop that. If you look at, and so I had our folks go back, and if you go just before the iPhone came out, Apple stock was at about $70, $85 a share. After the iPhone 5 release, it's at $700 a share. I missed that. But let's say, now let's turn that around. Let's say that Apple's intellectual property for the iPhone and iPad were stolen. Think about if somebody beat them to market with some of that, what the impact would have been on their stock and on us, because that would have affected the New York, or the, our stock market, the NASDAQ. And when you look at that, this is just one company. Now, they haven't been hit, but you look at the companies that you were talking about, some of those have been bankrupt. DigiNotar.
Go on, tell the story. What happened?
Well, and so DigiNotar was one that had certificates, and they worked with Google and others, were stolen by an adversary. The certificates allow you to communicate securely to say, I know that you're Google and that you can update my Chrome system, and you have a certificate to come in and do that, so I accept those as verified that you're the right person coming in. Somebody stole those so they could hijack those communications, and DigiNotar went out of business in 30 days.
So a company that was providing secure communications had its security compromised.
Impacted.
And-
It lost so really what happened is the faith of companies like Google and DigiNotar went down to the point where they went out of business, bankrupt. And you look, RSA, probably one of the best. Now, they didn't go bankrupt. They're probably one of the best standards in the country in terms of cybersecurity. They had a break-in, very public. I think they handled it very well. Again, somebody wanted to steal their two-factor authentication, like PayPal. And so what they're doing is they're stealing this to get deeper into networks of some of these companies, like Lockheed and others. And you see this going on all the time. And so it is a significant problem. And the two problems, if you put them on the table, overlap. And they overlap in that they both depend on malicious software to get into your system or to make something happen. And I think
Two problems meaning intellectual property theft and actual attacks.
and disruptive, destructive attacks. The two parts that the senator mentioned. So if you put both those on the table, the solution is information sharing, working together in a transparent way. And I think that was where our conversation.
Anthony Romero, help us continue to define the problem.
Yeah, I mean, so far there's nothing with which I can disagree, and all I can do is wholeheartedly endorse both the fact that Congresswoman Harman is having us have this discussion is incredibly important. And when you ask a question about what are you most concerned or afraid of, when we talk about information technology and cybersecurity, it's every aspect of our lives, from communicating with our children, to our doctors, to our banks, to our government. I mean, remember, we have electronic voting systems in part of this country. It's not far-fetched to think that they're also a key part of how the body politic works. And so that's why I'm just thrilled to be a part of the discussion here, especially with Senator Collins, who's played such a critical role, and General Alexander. This issue requires a public debate. And if there's one thing I fault the legacy of where we've been before on intelligence and security, especially in the years of President Bush, has been we didn't have these fora. We didn't have these debates. They were done often in secret without C-SPAN covering it and without the public debating it. And so we are all the better for having this discussion. And all I can say is personally, it's every aspect of our life is affected by this. And protecting the infrastructure of how it affects our everyday lives is an obligation that only the government can fulfill. It is not a private sector obligation. It can't be a nonprofit organization such as my own that can fulfill that obligation. It is the government's obligation, and we have to help them get there. And I will just say, from my point of view, I'm the head of the American Civil Liberties Union. I'm also a CEO of a corporation. We have $350 million in assets. We have 900 employees nationwide. I have a membership list of 550,000 members that are my bread and butter. I mail to them. I get hacked all the time. People are always attacking us. Now, I'm sure no one in this room, but there are a number of individuals who may disagree with our substantive points of view, and they shut our system down. They try to get into my membership file. They try to get into my bank data. And so these are concerns which I very much share as an individual, not just as an American who wants to be able to call my mother and make sure her doctor's appointment went well, because the wrath of God will be great if I don't make that phone call when she expects it. But I want to be able to make sure I can contact my colleagues, my workers, my bank, and it's just a question of how we do it. I think that's the most critical part of it. I think we're a long way there by having these discussions. The things I'm most interested in, right, is making sure that when we have this discussion that there is proper oversight and accountability of how we share this information across the different parts of the private sector and the government. Making sure that there is proper public oversight. If it's very personal to us, then we want that part of our government with the greatest accountability to have responsibility for it. That's why I think General Alexander's suggestion earlier of Department of Homeland Security being in the saddle, at the center of making that happen, I think is critical. Making sure that we're very smart about what information is shared at what level of detail. And the question of how personally identifiable information that perhaps won't be necessary. Like the Easy Pass analogy, I'm stealing your script, but I'm sure you will sing it much better than I.
Explain it for people, go right ahead.
You know, the idea of just being able to have certain data that's collected that sends off certain bells and whistles within the sector that says, okay, this might be of concern, but not collecting everyone's information in a massive data aggregation that gets sucked into a major central database. I mean, there are ways for us to really throw the switch that's very specific in terms of what are we looking for, from where, what type of information, what type of, and that's good national security. As we've always said before, the problem with good intelligence is to finding the needle in the haystack. And you make it all the harder when you throw more hay on the haystack to find that one needle. So we do ourselves a service in keeping better national security by being smart from the beginning about that which we're trying to identify and for what purpose.
Go ahead.
Could I add in? I agree with everything that you said. In fact, I'd like to just put on the table the team, the cyber team that our government needs here. As you correctly stated, I see DHS as the entry point for working with industry, and I think there are great reasons for that. Totally. The transparency, everybody knows we're doing this exactly right. And when you look at this gets the best of our team together. So you've got DHS doing that. There's a lot that we can do to help them on the technical front, FBI, NSA, and Cyber Command, and we should work together as a team to do that. FBI would have the lead for the law enforcement and the attribution parts of this, and NSA on the foreign intelligence, and Cyber Command on defending the nation. And together, that team is what I think the American people hold us accountable for doing. And you would expect, as we discussed earlier, that's where you want this team to get together and make sure it works right. Have it transparent with oversight. But everyone here knows, and the analogy of the car, I think, is a good analogy, because what we're asking industry to do is to look, if you see these kind of bad things going on, let us know right away. Let the government know. It's just like calling for fire alarm, 911, call us and we'll respond. And if otherwise, we don't need to know what traffic is transiting.
Could I just raise something, Steve, at this point? How many people here have been hacked?
Number of hands going up, okay.
That's pretty. And how many aren't sure but think maybe sort of kind of you were hacked?
How many don't want to admit it?
And how many don't want to admit it? But it's a big portion. I think it would be helpful, that's why while we're defining the problem, to be a little more specific to people who are here for a reason. They want to understand the subject, and I hope participate in the best solution. How does this work? I mean, you're training DHS to look for what? And the public should understand they're looking for what. And here's our civil liberties bells and whistles person over here. His level of comfort matters, because obviously the goal here is to do two things at the same time. One is protect our country and our infrastructure, and the second is protect why we are a great country, and that's
right.
our civil liberties and our Constitution. So could somebody maybe be a little more specific about how do you know the red car is going by?
So there's a couple ways. But first, I do have I got from Norton study 2012, 72% of people online have been hacked or victims of a cybercrime. So that means your chances, it would be 3/4 of the room, and the other quarter they have not yet gotten to. So it's significant. How that works and how the antivirus community does it is by, we call it signatures, but it's actually signatures and different techniques that you see and things like that. And what's a signature? It is something that they have, think of this as a scan. When you go to the grocery store, you scan in your food for money. And you have this barcode that goes by. So think of it as a barcode. And it lets all the barcodes go by except for this one version or these several versions. Maybe all these that have this version is alarmed by the internet service providers, as an example, and they say, I've got a problem here. And that can be done without a human in it. It actually is done by a machine that says, I saw the red car or a bad thing happening. I tell the government, we've got a problem. And that red car was coming from point A going to point B. So we know it came from there, and we know it's going to there. So this company has the potential target. So you know all that because of the way the packets and stuff in the network go. So
You're saying the key is to identify, to be able to recognize a particular virus, a particular worm as it moves around the system.
and to
And to spread the word of that.
And it gets a little bit more complicated, but that's in essence the way it all works. And it's done by actually the way the packet is and what's in the packet. The internet service providers do that as a service today. They do that so that your networks operate securely. They try to weed out as much as they can. And what they'll tell you is they have a limit to what they can do because of where they are technically. So we know some information. Other parts of industry knows information. FBI and DHS has information. If you want to really make it secure, what we would say is, well, you know, the American people would say, well, why don't you work together? And that's the whole intent. We've got to work together so that each of those missions can be done. I think, you know, what I was mentioning back, I think our internet service providers are extraordinary. They do a great job. But they would tell you it would be better if they could partner. Now, there's some issues that have to be put on the table. The transparency is one, liability is another.
Well, let me let Anthony finish the point there, if we can, because when you talk about transparency, I mean, you're saying that it is essential for the United States government to be involved with companies that virtually all of us use, with which we entrust our most sensitive information in many cases, and for the government to have a dialogue and discussion with them that might involve a lot of being very close to a lot of intimate information about our lives.
But I think that's where it's all a matter of who is tasked with the job. And that if you have a Department of Homeland Security, which is raison d'etre, and we've often heard criticisms, sometimes publicly, that the Department of Homeland Security is not up to the job. Well, that is their job. It's almost like saying it is your job to defend the homeland. And if they can't pull this together, then we have to have a very different conversation about why we have a Department of Homeland Security that can't defend the homeland from one of the most critical, far-ranging areas of threat. And so many of the criticisms we've heard from individuals in the Senate and the House, that luckily we've had the leadership of Senator Collins, have said, well, DHS can't do it. Well, they must do it. That's the reason why we're there. If not, we have to have a very different type of conversation about DHS.
Okay, what is DHS's involvement in cybersecurity right now? Just lay out the groundwork, the basics.
Frankly, it's often unclear to us to the extent in which there is information sharing and there is an involvement. It's at a very low level. It's not very forthcoming. They certainly, in my opinion, in general, you'll know this much better than I do, but they're a reluctant participant in some of these discussions. They feel like they have a lot on their plate. I think that you have had very kind of key individuals here on this table making this point much more salient. Joseph Nye at Harvard has been brilliant at raising this concern more publicly, and so I think it's gotten the attention it deserves. But for me, the reason why DHS must be charged with it is because there you ensure the accountability. You have an ability in terms of getting information to the various members of Congress. You have an Office of Inspector General. You can have a GAO report. You can have hearings called by Congresswoman Harman to make sure that we have these.
Senator Collins.
We're not capable of having that level of civilian oversight if it were placed, with all due respect, General, in the Pentagon. It's just not, it's a very different beast. And so when you're talking about something as significant as the personal identifiable information of Americans and how we interact with the world, I worry that if that is in the domain of a military complex where it's harder to kind of shine the light in those black boxes.
First, Congresswoman Harman, they would probably let you still call a hearing if you wanted.
I would.
Just a second, if I can, because you were directly addressing the. Do you agree with what he just said regarding the idea that a civilian agency needs to be the lead on this as opposed to the military? That was the statement that was made.
I think, given where the discussion is, I believe that's the correct thing to do. Especially if we can handle the technical problems of allowing FBI, NSA, and Cyber Command to do their jobs, then yes, it allows for the transparency which I think the American people need in this area. Cyber is so important to all of us. You want to know we're doing it right. And the way to do that is to be transparent, to put that out. From my perspective, we can do both, and we should do both. And I don't have a problem with that accountability at all and that transparency. And, as I mentioned earlier, this is a team. We all have to work together. And I think by you knowing that we're working together and not one of us individually, you know that we're going to do this right.
That's right.
There's some other things, though, and I think Senator Collins was going to bring this up, so I'm going to pass this to Senator Collins because my experience with DHS is they are growing and they're coming on fast. Secretary Napolitano, Mark Weatherford, and their cyber group are doing a good job. They need help. We are helping. We've got to work together as a team. And from where I sit, it's our job to help them be successful. Right. And they will get there. They are taking the right steps, and I think that's the right thing to do. Now, we can throw rocks at them, but the reality is I think our nation needs them to be in the middle of this. And so I'll pass it over to you.
I just want to clarify what DHS's role is now. First, it's responsible for the .gov domain. In other words, the civilian agency's computer security. Second, it's responsible for being the liaison to the private sector. And third, it's responsible for critical infrastructure. That's not a new responsibility. The department was given the responsibility for securing critical infrastructure in the Homeland Security Act of 2002. And so I think it's important to understand what the domain, what the responsibility of DHS is now. It does not have responsibility for the .mil part of our government. It does not have the expertise of Cyber Command or NSA, but it does operate a 24-hour watch center that is called the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center. I just call it the Cybersecurity Center, but the insiders call it NCIC. Don't ask me why. It is responsible for monitoring in real time what is happening in the .gov space. And it probably will not come as a surprise to you to know that the cyber preparedness of our civilian agencies in the federal government has a lot to be desired, and it varies enormously from agency to agency. Now, at this center are representatives of the private sector, from NSA, from the Department of Justice, from the Department of Commerce, and they're all working together as a team approach. And that's what it takes. And that's what the bill that Joe Lieberman and I wrote would codify, is a team approach to establishing cyber standards, best practices for the private sector to voluntarily adopt and in exchange get liability protection. But DHS cannot do it without the help of NSA. That's absolutely critical because NSA is always going to be the expert. But NSA does not have the relationships with the civilian agencies and with the private sector and with the critical infrastructure operators that DHS does. And that's why that partnership's essential.
Is there now, does your bill create, or does there need to be a central person who is accountable and responsible, a director of national intelligence, so to speak, for cybersecurity?
That's an issue that we've struggled with. At one point, the administration wanted a cyber center within the White House. And there were a lot of us who had qualms about that for actually reasons that I think Anthony will be very sympathetic to, because that person is not accountable. Anytime you create a czar-like position within the White House, we can't call them before Congress to testify, to be accountable, to be questioned. And so that is not the approach that I think is best. What we finally have come up with is a council that would be chaired by the Department of Homeland Security in our bill, but would have a broad range of representation across the federal government.
I wonder if, and we're going to get to you, Anthony, in a second, but I wonder if, in the end, cyber threats are a little like the word terrorism. It can be a catch-all word. It can catch a lot of different threats. It's actually a technique of attack that many different agencies you would want to share information about, but it's not a fundamental problem that needs to be attacked as a problem. Is this what you're suggesting? I mean, it's just so broad.
It is broad, but it's a fundamental problem nonetheless, because our society is increasingly a wired society. And if you think back, we've had building codes forever, for generations, to make sure that if a building is constructed, that it meets certain standards for the electrical wiring and for the plumbing. Well, now that we're in a society, in an economy, in which computers operate virtually everything, and industrial controls are so critical to the operation of everything that controls the basic necessities of our life, it seems to me that we've got to have standards that are met. And the best way to do that is through a collaborative system that draws upon the expertise of the private sector and the knowledge of government.
Yeah, maybe there's one other metaphor or example that would fit what Senator Collins is just saying. I'm from California, earthquake country, and buildings and freeways and whatever have to meet certain seismic standards. Otherwise, it all falls down and hurts all of us. I would think that this is similar. And think floods and tornadoes and so forth in other parts of the country. Minimum standards have to be met or the infrastructure falls down. And this critical infrastructure, the whole cyber world, makes everything else, basically everything else work. And so I guess your argument is there are minimum standards, at least on a voluntary basis. I think you changed it from mandatory to voluntary, that have to be met, or this whole network that supports all of us falls down.
Anthony Romero.
But I think your analogy is exactly the way I wanted. The cybersecurity issues certainly evokes the debate around terrorism. And of course they're related. They interacted very directly in the aftermath of 9/11. And I think part of our concerns in getting the details right and asking the pesky questions, we were teasing each other before about making sure that we were working nicely here on the podium in front of everyone. But, and that is, of course, our way, because we're civil libertarians, after all. But it's also because of a history. And in the name of terrorism, fighting terrorism, we tortured, we abrogated due process for certain detainees. We opened a military camp in Guantanamo that remains open to this day, even though this president and many wish to close it, including Senator McCain from the Republican Party. And so we did many egregious things that we have now come to regret. In the name of national security and cybersecurity, we could easily go too far as well. And we don't have to go that far to remember this. I've only been director of the ACLU for the past 12 years. I lived total information awareness, Operation TIPS, Terrorism Information Protection System, the NSA leak that was leaked out to the New York Times, the questions around the Patriot Act provisions about getting library records without proper oversight of Congress. And so when there is a bit of energy that is around what are sometimes difficult policy issues, I think that's to the good. I think we've done our job. I think that's what democracy looks like. And the reason why people are worked up or concerned and sometimes sending pesky letters or pesky floor amendments is because we got it wrong for a number of years. And when you're talking about the very personal information of people in their everyday lives, we want to do our best to get it right.
Help me define the problem there. What is an example of something the government could plausibly do in the name of security in this area that would scare you?
Well, I think certainly locating any of this information, gathering, the cybersecurity concern within the military or the NSA, I'm not buying it. We've given too much power to it. Too obtuse, can't get it. We litigate over the military every time. We litigate the CIA, we litigate DOD. Give me the civilian agencies any day. If you're going to adhere to the rule of law, give me an equal playing field.
Even though they're the guys who may have the expertise and may be able to get the job
We
done.
are the American government. We are the United States of America. If you're telling me that the military is the only thing that can work, then we're in a very different country than one I want to live in. No offense, General. I want my civilian part of my government to work just as well as my military. So if you tell me that the only thing that works in America is the Pentagon, then I want to renegotiate my taxes with this government.
Well, we have civilian oversight of the military in this country. But
But
General Alexander just said, this is why I'm up here sitting right next to you, my friend, with great love and affection. He just said that he welcomes civilian oversight of this problem by DHS, and he and a group of folks on this committee, or at least informally until we have this much needed legislation, I'm very objective about this, are helping DHS get up to speed. So that concept is fine.
It's retired. Then I think the level of personally identifiable information, just making sure you don't collect everything on everyone, that it just gets sucked into some kind of central system that people can get access to. Because let's face it, that is often happening in other contexts. Facebook. The idea that everything I've ever posted, and I don't have a Facebook page because I refuse. I'm the last one who gets invited every day to join Facebook. But the idea that your personal information is theirs forever and everything you put is theirs for them to own or for them to market is just a frightening thought.
That's a private.
That's a private
concern
sector. I know, and we don't have the control to manage that. If I could find some exercise over the Facebook policies, I'd love it. But the American government is different. Why? Because only the American government has the ability to take away your freedoms. Facebook can't come and arrest me. They can't seize my bank accounts. They don't have the the powers of the police state. The government can take away my liberty in the most fundamental way. They can seize my assets. They can restrict my movement. Facebook can make my life difficult if I choose to be on Facebook. The American government could lock me up, could take my assets, could put me on a watch list, could adhere my ability to travel on airplanes throughout the public spaces. That's why it's so much more critical to get this right when we're talking about the government owning and possessing this data.
Let me make sure that we define that as well, General Alexander, just so that people understand what authority, if any, do you or does your agency now have to look at the information of U.S. persons, of American citizens and others living here, of their bank accounts, of data centers, whatever the reason might be? What authority do you have? What authority would you envision having?
None right now without a warrant, and it would be normally through the FBI or something like that.
Right.
Now let me go back, because I do want to just push back a little bit on Anthony here.
Sure.
Because I haven't been in the agency as long as you've been at ACLU, but I've been there over 7 years, and they said I have to stay until I get it right. So this is going to take a while. I'm an Army guy. I am absolutely impressed with the way our people deal with Americans' civil liberties and privacy, the way we ensure that our civil liberties are protected. Everyone at NSA has to go through a course, because in the collection of our stuff overseas, we're going to see American data, and we protect that. And we respond to the House Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, the Department of Justice, the Pentagon, the DNI, anybody else. And every time we make a mistake, we self-report and we correct it. I don't know of anybody else in government that goes to that extent to ensure that we do this right.
And that's only because, with all due respect, sir, with great fondness and affection,
How great.
only because the NSA got caught with its hand in the cookie jar twice now. Once, with the whole effort with Roger Banford and others who was clearly involved in surveillance it should have been. Secondly, in my mind, although the Congress gave President Bush the get out of jail free card by authorizing NSA through the FISA Amendments Act, FISA Amendments Act, which gave them the power after the fact. And the only reason why I'm concerned is because I'm sure it's true. I know that the men and women in uniform who occupy your role, many of them I've met over the years. I think many of the women in the intelligence community are terrific. Bob Mueller is a terrific man who cares about these issues, great integrity. I've sued him half a dozen times in the last 6 months. But I,
Is this where the taser comes out?
I agree to disagree with him. But the concern I have about the military is that it really is quite a different thing when we're thinking about, and I think this is where you and I completely coincide philosophically, with Americans' data. It should not be the locus of activity, should not be our military. It should not be. I mean, it's what we expect the civilian agencies of our government. And I think at the end of the day, I think the biggest concern is that there's so much that's there. And it's not like I've done anything wrong. We talk about this all the time. Well, why do I care the government should access my email inappropriately? You know, I've done nothing wrong. I'm not breaking the law. I don't want them to see some of the interaction between me and my nephew. You know, the embarrassing things. He's a teenager. I'm trying to explain to him certain aspects of adult life, which I don't really want to embarrass the poor fella about asking me some of those key questions in an email where, how do I going to write the answer back in proper language that he can understand that won't get caught by the filter that he might have on his computer? You have to think about these things. I want to teach a young man how to be a responsible adult with his body and with other people's bodies. You want to have those discussions properly. And you don't want the government picking up that conversation between an uncle and his teenage nephew. And it would be mortifying for a teenage nephew to have his communications picked up and asking an uncle a question that he thinks that he knows already. There's just little things in every aspects of one's life you just don't want the government to pick up. And I think finding the proper restrictions around it, finding the proper locus of activities, finding proper oversight with our members of the Senate and the House, I think are a key part of it. And making sure we get it right, because we've gotten it wrong.
Senator Collins is about to offer some oversight. Please, go right ahead.
First, I want to speak to this because I don't want there to be an impression created that the bill that we tried to get through would in any way allow the situation
It's a
that
great bill.
Anthony just described. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in this area. First of all, and the general can speak to this better than I, but he educated me on this issue. The so-called digital signatures that we're talking about here are ones and zeros in various patterns. They aren't the content of emails.
Right.
They are being used to identify dangerous malware or attacks that are coming into the system. Second, our bill specifically makes sure that any information that the private sector gives to the government related to cybersecurity is, there's a horrible word for it, but it's something like anonymized.
Right.
And that word obviously speaks to the fact that any personal data related to it that would help you to personally identify an individual would not be transmitted. And so there are
Is this the
all
equivalent
these
of like wiretap
safeguards.
phone calls? They're supposed to stop listening if there's personal discussions going on in a wiretap phone call. That's what you're. That's the digital equivalent of that. Is that what you're saying?
no,
With
that-
anonymized.
No, it
Help
doesn't.
me out.
It doesn't work like that, and I will let the general, since he can describe it.
What you're
more.
actually, it is kind of interesting. We're arguing over a bad guy putting something in your email, sending it to somebody else to do something to him that you didn't know was going on.
Right.
So ironically, both of you want to know that that's occurring. And what happens is the machines can see signatures. They can see those go by and alert on them. There is nothing about the traffic or the communications that the government will get, civilian or military. So nothing in the communications come to the government. Only the fact, let's call the signatures A through a billion. We have a billion signatures. I think McAfee's
By
up
nothing, you mean no content.
to no content.
Right.
That's right. So all you're going to get is that, let's call the signatures and enumerate them. Start with A. So signature A goes by. All the government needs to know, DHS, FBI, NSA, and Cyber Command, is that A event occurred. We don't need to know anything more about the communications that A occurred. And so what the government finds out is A occurred, and it was going from point A to from one point to another. I can't use point A because it was in the A. I get it. And I think you do. Okay, so tracking that, what that means is all the government's being told is this. Now here's a great point about where we are in the internet today. Everything we do in this area is auditable, 100%. As it is with what NSA does in our activities, 100% auditable by all the agencies I talked about. So we have everything that we do is 100% auditable. In this area, it would be too. And the key, the reason that I really believe that DHS is in there is so that you all know we're doing this right. It's transparent. It is being done right. We've got everybody working together. It is a great way. And actually, you know, you want us to defend the country against an attack. You don't want us to be in the middle over here, operating in the country, trying to set something up or working with industry when we should be defending the nation. So our job is to defend the nation. DHS is the other.
And if I could just add
Sure.
one quick point. Our bill has vigorous oversight requirements in it. It requires regular reports by all the IGs, by the GAO, and by the Privacy and Civil Liberties Board, which, by the way, this administration was extraordinarily slow to appoint members to, which has always been baffling to me.
I just want to make sure I understand the basics, then I'm going to open it up for questions here, Senator, about your bill. You've just described this search for digital signatures. If I'm not mistaken, you're describing something that goes on all the time now, that the government tries to do on its own systems. That go on, yes? That
There isn't information sharing to the degree we would like to have.
That was the next. You're talking about something that individual organizations, in theory at least, try to do to protect themselves. My own antivirus protection on my computer may try to do that. Your bill is an effort to increase the cooperation between different institutions and corporations as they share information so that they can all be looking for threats together. Is that correct?
Correct. And if there is a major breach in critical infrastructure, it has to be reported.
Right.
What happens now is a lot of companies try to keep this quiet.
Sure.
They're worried about what the reaction of their customers and clients would be, so they don't want to report.
Right.
We want to give them incentives to report. We want to require them to report if it's a major breach, but we want to give them incentives by giving them some liability protection.
And part of what I want to be clear is that the bill that Senator Collins is describing, her own bill with Senator Feinstein and Lieberman, is, I think it strikes the right balance. I mean, there are very many parts of it that we think are absolutely right on the money. There are always things we disagree with. I mean, we can't help ourselves, Senator, so you just have to forgive me for, you know, the sins of the father visited on the children. But by and large, that's the right framework. Now, there are other models being thrown out there that I think are highly much more problematic, which are much more reminiscent of opaque data collection in different parts of the federal government that have us much more worried. And I think the most important part is this debate. I mean, I really do keep coming back to it. The idea that we're having this discussion prior to, rather than after the fact, is critical. And let's work on figuring out the details.
One quick question on the bill before we go to questions here, Senator. You mentioned that these are voluntary rules. I mean, people would sign up, they would get incentives of various kinds. Ms. Harmon used the analogy of building codes, though. Building codes don't tend to be voluntary.
True.
Why make these requirements voluntary? Why not mandatory?
Our bill originally made them mandatory and gave the liability relief. Frankly, it was a calculation on our part that the private sector would be less worried about the bill if they were voluntary standards, and that the incentives were sufficient that they would participate anyway, particularly when we made it very clear that the private sector would be involved in developing the standards. So it was partially a policy calculation and a political calculation. In the end, I don't think our change from mandatory to voluntary standards brought us a single extra vote in the Senate, but that was the decision that we made.
It's so rare that things get bottled up in Congress these days. It's surprising that would happen like this.
Sometimes a bottle up is okay. When things get trammeled through like the Patriot Act, without a bottle up, with too little debate and lack of knowledge and lack of transparency, that doesn't make democracy look any better. I mean, the reason why we have two branches of government in the Congress, three branches of government.
Three now.
I know, three misspoke. Three branches, two houses, right? Is because we believe in a series of checks and balances. Checks and balances make democracy messy, contentious, sometimes slow, sometimes an impasse. That's what democracy looks like.
Could I just say one more thing,
Go right ahead.
Steve, since I've behaved myself pretty well? As someone who was in our Congress during those years and tried very hard to get full information, it was frustrating for members of Congress too.
Yeah.
And many members of Congress felt there needed to be, and there still needs to be, a robust debate in the public square about basically, my version is a new legal framework to fit the requirements of a 9/11 world, which is a different world. But the public has to be part of it. I think Senator Collins is right about the Privacy and Civil Liberties Board, which was required in the 2004 information reform law that we worked on together and has never been vigorous. Ever. Not yet, not under either the Bush or the Obama administration. And the goal is, and I think General Alexander would buy this, I just thought I'd conclude on a note of unanimity here, for the I can never remember this word, but the mutually reinforcing values of security and liberty to be factored in at the same time when we make policy. It's not a zero-sum game. You don't get more of one or less of the other. You either get more of both or less of both. And so the conversation here today is about how we can do both and how we can do it in a way that the public understands, or how our government can, that the public understands.
There's one reason why I think we need to figure it out also at the beginning, is that very often the public and the affected communities are not in a position to question it after the fact. So I'll give you one example. The FISA Amendments Act allows the U.S. government to intercept my U.S. citizen emails when I'm overseas, or if I'm emailing overseas. So if my sister's in London Or my nephew's in London, let's say, that same little nephew who I'm trying to explain the birds and the bees to, happens to be in Mexico, and he's asking me a question. My communication to him can be intercepted to Mexico without court oversight. Whereas if I'm emailing him in Florida, it's protected. Now, we are in the Supreme Court. The ACLU is arguing this case in the Supreme Court October 29th, where the issue is, do we have standing to question this law? We have humanitarian groups, we have human rights groups, we have groups in Egypt who are collecting data on the activities of their countries. They're emailing them to us so we can interact together as human rights campaigners. We have Guantanamo lawyers who are representing individuals at Guantanamo military commissions who are trying to interact with family members overseas in some of the hot spots. Attorney-client privilege is implicated, but you have no proof that those emails are being intercepted. So the individual, we're now asserting we can show the harm, because the harm is chilling our ability to do our work. And so that's why you have to get it right from the beginning, because you can't challenge it after
That's
the
the
fact.
third branch of government, right? Just to be
It's the
clear on that.
judiciary, 3 branches.
Okay. Oh, no, if you're
Well, I was
general.
going to say, it just came up. The
Okay,
third branch.
okay, that's
Keep
good.
going.
All right, let me invite your questions. I'd like to state a couple of rules. I believe there's a microphone or two that will come to you. If you have a question, I would ask you first to state your name so that we can get to know each other at least a little bit, and make it a single direct question so that we can get as many of you in as we can. And we'll go right to the back. Please go right ahead back there, ma'am. Go ahead and stand up so we can see you.
But I can't say.
Oh.
Jen Schultes from Congressional Quarterly, and this question is for Senator Collins. You said that the change in the bill to make things voluntary probably didn't get you any votes. I know that if you knew what would get you the votes, you would have done it, but either this Congress or in the next or the one after that, where do you see any of these tweaks coming that you think maybe that can move this?
Well, I certainly hope that this isn't a case where we have to wait for a cyber 9/11 before action is taken. It is encouraging to me that although my close partner, Joe Lieberman, will regrettably be retiring, that the next person who would be either the chairman of the committee or the ranking member is also a co-sponsor and involved in the bill, and that is Tom Carver. This problem's not going to go away regardless of who's in charge in the administration, regardless of who wins the presidential election. The problem is only going to get worse. The number of attacks has grown exponentially over the past couple of years, and it's going to only get worse. I'm reminded of the words that Michael Chertoff and General Hayden said when they essentially said that they were haunted by the fact that there was intelligence prior to the attacks on our country on 9/11, but that no one connected the dots. And if they had done so, perhaps the attack could have been averted. In this case, the dots are already connected. The alarm has already been sounded, and we know that it's only a matter of when, not whether, we have a catastrophic attack. So my hope is that this isn't a case where Congress does nothing until there is a catastrophic attack on our critical infrastructure, and then inevitably we will overreact and pass legislation that will make Anthony very uncomfortable, and many of the rest of us as well. So my hope is that after the election, cooler heads will prevail, and as more and more people get educated on this issue and determined to do something about it, as more and more companies have the personal experience with a cyber attack, that we can build enough public support to get the job done.
So you see it more a matter of public awareness and politics than changing the bill in some way that you could
I
find?
do.
Okay. All right. A couple more questions. There's time. Back there, sir. Go right ahead. Oh, in the back row again. Then we'll go to you in front of him. Please go right ahead. In front of the cameras. Yeah.
Zach Biggs, Defense News. I'm curious, General, you said that a couple of the major concerns that the Senator mentioned being protecting critical infrastructure and protecting intellectual property were, I believe you said, solvable. I'm curious, what does that mean as far as what would it take to solve those particular issues?
Hand the
Yeah.
microphone to the gentleman in front of you. there.
Thanks, because I want to clarify, we're never going to get rid of 100%. So when I say solvable, what I mean is we can mitigate most of the problems that we're seeing on the network today. When you see how the defense networks with one level of protection is able to operate, the rest of government at a different level, the first thing you'd say is we ought to fix that and we ought to work this together. And I'm happy to say that DHS and the Defense Department are working together to address that problem. Then the question that you pose then is, so what about critical infrastructure? You know, the Defense Department and DHS isn't here to defend the government. Who's defending the nation? And the answer is, well, that's probably the government's responsibility, and here's how we have to do it. We have to partner together. And so, from my perspective, by putting all the information on the table so the internet service providers and others have access to that information within industry and from government, that's what it takes to help mitigate this. And I think we can mitigate a large portion of it. What that does is takes much of the junk out of the system and allows us to look at the more persistent threats. And that's what we need to get to.
The gentleman who now has the microphone, go right ahead. Stand up.
John Reed with Foreign Policy. So there's already a program in place where the Defense Department and the intelligence community and defense contractors can share information about cyber threats, and it's being expanded to include DHS, possibly, and critical infrastructure providers. How does that relate to the executive order that's working its way through the White House, and also the need for legislation? I mean, how do they relate? Is there still a need, or what is the need?
So I believe there is a need, and I can address the defense industrial base pilot is a way of exchanging information, but not in real time and without the liability protection. And it's between the defense industrial base, those companies that work with the Defense Department to help them protect their information. We exchange information on that at an unclassified and a low level of classification level. It doesn't give us the ability to work with the internet service providers and allow that to benefit the rest of the critical infrastructure and the rest of government. So that's really what we need the legislation for, is to work between industry and government in this way. I think as we've done in the managed security services, we've now given that over to DHS to run for the government, and we provide the technical assistance. I think that's a great step forward, and it shows you a step towards what could be done in legislation for information sharing.
You've said several times liability protection. I just want to make sure I understand what that means on a basic level. You're saying that a company is telling the government, if I'm going to let you into my systems, if I'm going to share information with you, I need to know that I'm not going to be sued for some problem that arises from that. That's on a most basic level. And do you want to answer this question about how far the bill goes beyond what's already being done?
Yes. First of all, I totally agree with the general's analysis of what's known as the DIB project and having it expanded, but there's no way that it will have the breadth that would be brought about by our legislation. I want to also touch on the executive order that you mentioned. I personally believe that while I understand and share the president's frustration over the failure of Congress to act, that the executive order is a big mistake. First of all, the executive order cannot grant the liability protections that are needed in order to encourage more participation by the private sector. So the executive order simply cannot accomplish what legislation can. In addition, an executive order is not lasting. And it doesn't reflect a consensus by Congress on what should be done. So I think the executive order is a mistake. I've urged the president not to pursue it, but rather to continue to work with us. And I fear that it actually could lull people into a false sense of security that we've taken care of cybersecurity. And the executive order simply cannot do that.
And
Peter?
the one thing I would add to
Anthony, excuse me.
Senator Collins is that in addition to the fact that this needs a thorough debate and both houses of Congress engaged with a piece of legislation that could outlast a president, any action by any occupant of the White House on an executive order that either mandates a collection of data across federal agencies worries me. And just because it's President Obama, who might be a bit frustrated at the gridlock in Washington, that's what we've got. And it's not going to be President Obama forever. And we've had President Bush, and we start using those executive order powers for good reasons. We'll find them used and turned right on us for bad reasons in subsequent administrations. And so I completely agree with Senator Collins that that cannot be the full-time or the long-term solution to this issue. It's misguided. It might come back to backfire on us, and it's just not going to solve the problem on a long-term issue like the one that she's outlined.
Got time for a few more questions? Is anybody closer to the front that has a question here at all? Oh, okay, I guess not, but there's one in the back. Go ahead, ma'am.
Thank you. My name is Lily Coney. I'm with the Electronic Privacy Information Center. I want to ask a question about oversight, congressional oversight specifically. We spoke a great deal about internal agency oversight, IG, all of it very excellent. But the complexity of cybersecurity for government agencies and non-government entities, I was wondering if you were thinking in terms of what needs to happen so that congressional oversight is up to the task of protecting privacy and civil liberties, specifically looking at the structures, staff, skill sets, organization of committees, thinking more creatively about how to keep up with oversight responsibilities of congressional committees. Thank you.
In our bill, all of those reports that we would mandate in our bill from the IGs of various departments, the Inspector Generals, from the Government Accountability Office, and from the Privacy Board would be reports to Congress. And if I'm the chairman, I can assure you we would have hearings on those reports. But those reports are in many ways an action-forcing mechanism. By having those reports out there available to review by your organization, by the ACLU, by other privacy groups, it will prompt Congress to take a close look at them. IG reports we pay attention to. When an Inspector General does an analysis, and Jane Harmon and I, when we helped to write, we're two of the four authors of the Intelligence Reform Act in 2004, we insisted on having that privacy board, which is why we've been so disappointed that two administrations now have really sort of brushed it aside. Yep. And it's something we're going to continue to push on.
Expertise.
What I'm specifically asking about is this is a highly complex area,
right,
where cryptographers, you need computer security expertise. If you're looking at bulking up the technical expertise within the committees themselves to be able to engage in peer-to-peer discussions with agencies, with industries, as they look at the information coming in to better inform and bulk up the resources of the committee to engage at a higher level?
Well, even being in the minority, I have always had an attorney on my staff who is assigned privacy issues. And I've always placed a great premium on that. I'm not saying that the expertise is equal to that that we might find in some advocacy groups, but we interact with those advocacy groups, and that expertise does exist in the oversight offices that would be reporting to us. So I really don't see that as being a big problem for us.
Let me ask you both, because we have two people who've been on sensitive committees. Are you confident that you have the time as busy lawmakers, the staffing as senators and members of Congress, the access to really get into what a variety of agencies, including intelligence agencies, are doing on any given sensitive topic?
Do you want to do intel?
Well, I think I hinted before that I asked for a lot of material that I never got, and I think Congress over a long period of time was shortchanged. I think that is improving, and as I mentioned, I serve on the advisory board to Jim Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, who has reviewed with me and others on that board what he does to keep Congress fully informed. I think members of Congress have an obligation to do deep dives in areas that are of critical importance. That doesn't mean every member has to know about this issue. I can tell you this member of Congress over here would astound you if you had enough time to learn what she knows. And I've seen her briefing books at night. I mean, she is no fun, just no fun. All she does is work. But seriously, some members of Congress take this responsibility very seriously. Some staffs in Congress, and I think you would probably know that, I'm a former staffer, so is Susan Collins, take this very seriously. And Congress has the capability. I think the frustration with Congress right now is that the place is broken, not the people. There are a lot of very talented people in both parties, staff and members, who would like to contribute more. But the paradigm now is one party blames the other party for not solving the problem, and they never work together, which again is underlying this. Working together to solve a problem is the way to get the best solution, which is why it is very heartening that the person to my left sitting up here has said in every way that I've tried to hear that he's going to be part of the solution of this problem.
I'm part of the solution, and then we'll be part of the next solution.
Well, let me ask you about Congress. Are you confident that Congress has the capacity to provide oversight in this area?
No. But that's okay, because with oversight from Congress, I think Senator Collins said it, with the reports to Congress, then the public does. It's these opaque oversight mechanisms which worry me the most. We all pay attention to the OIG reports. They've been incredibly, the Inspector General reports have been incredibly important. GAO reports, if you can get them in time and they can focus on the right issues, they can be incredibly important. More importantly are the reports that are mandated from the government agencies themselves to Congress. It's only the reports on the Patriot Act, the use of the Patriot Act provisions, that we got to see how many tens of thousands of requests using these library record provisions, Section 215, 219, 217. That's the only way we knew it. Warrantless warrants, where they were able to get information from individuals without court oversight. That's the only way we got it. That's the only reason why we have a fighting chance on this issue. Now, expecting Congress to take up some of the things that it might be apprised of may be asking a lot. And this is no disrespect to these two incredible leaders of our congressional branch. But Congress was often asleep at the switch for many years. And the idea that we are going to trust Congress, and you'll forgive me because I do, I lived, and this is there are people who are very focused on it. But unless it's publicly accessible, unless it's accountable, unless it's parked at a civilian agency where the public can have access to the reports, I worry. And that's why I think the approach that Senator Collins and the approach that Congresswoman Harman and General Alexander have laid out is really the only way to begin to have the conversation.
How do you feel about congressional oversight, General?
Oh, we love it.
Quality of it.
We love it. Now his wire brush as a young lad, and I think actually, I think it's an important thing to do. I think the oversight, and it's not just by Congress, it's by the court and by the administration. So we get overseen by everybody. Right. I'm okay with that. I think it's right. I just put on the table, my experience is we have good people in the military, good people in the intelligence community, and good people in government. They are trying to do the right thing for our country. These are great people. It makes me proud to serve as the director of NSA. These are tremendous people. They know that everything we're doing is 100% auditable. We self-report. From my perspective, that's what the nation wants us to do. Remember, our legacy, these are the folks that helped us win World War II. Right. So that's the way we look at it. We want to protect America and our civil liberties and privacy, and I think we can do both.
Go ahead.
Can I ask a question?
Forum.
Well, thank you. No, but we haven't touched on this, and that's about the evolving tradecraft of the bad guys, the hackers. The hackers can be individuals, they can be governments, they can be some industry networks or whomever, but they're very smart. And my question basically is, how do we keep ahead of them? Are we able to recruit people who are as smart or smarter than they are, and what policies do we have to make that happen? I just put out there that I was speaking recently to the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Michael Oren, who told me that in Israel, not that there is anything like perfect protection from cyber threats, but they have it very well organized, and they start recruiting people at age 13. And they have some kind of educational program to do this, to advise them on, what this stuff is and how you identify and combat it. So
Because time is short, General Alexander, go ahead. Are they getting smarter than you?
Well, yeah, we have great people. We don't have a problem hiring people today. I think the real issue is how we ensure that there are performance and pay incentives to keep them on board. That's going to be the challenge, keeping these great people in the government and in the military. And we are working that. But right now, perhaps given where the economy is, we don't have the problem getting the people. We have great people. But we need to sustain that and across the next 10 years, and I think that's going to take some incentive pay, like we do with foreign languages now in the cyber area, and in math and others.
Are you concerned at all about giving foreign actors, in effect, permission to attack the United States or justification to attack the United States because of operations the United States may conduct overseas against various targets?
Well, I think that's where we are today. When you look at the way others can attack us, the most logical way is going to be terrorist attacks and cyber. And we're seeing both. And we've got to get ready for those as they become more frequent. And so, it's much more difficult to land a division in the North, and with our Canadian allies, they say, we trust you to an extent. No, I'm just kidding. And so, we're not worried about a land attack. We're worried about missiles. We're worried about, but the real way that I think people could come at us are terrorism and cyber. And
what I mean is the United States has cyber operations overseas, which I'm not asking you to confirm or deny, but I think about something like Stuxnet. Does that create a framework or a situation where other countries, other individuals might turn those same tactics and techniques back on the United States?
Well, I think there's a great deal, a plethora of tools out there. You only have to go out on Google and start searching for tools, and you'll find that there are thousands of tools publicly available and free that could impact us today and that would impact our critical infrastructure. And so what's going on the network, from my perspective, is it's growing exponentially. So I think, independent of what you bring up, that when you look at the crime and where people are going to just steal intellectual property, the way they develop those tools and the testing of those in and of itself brings up destructive tools. And let me be more clear. When they test a tool and they say, I want to go steal something, and so I've got this tool that takes advantage of a vulnerability and allows me access to your computer, what they find out in executing that is, oh, it broke their computer. Okay, so that tool didn't work, but you just found a destructive tool. And so in doing that, what adversaries, hackers, and others do in that whole scheme is grow these things. And they're out there. Some of them are for sale. You can buy botnets and stuff for spam, for distributed denial of service attacks. There is a lot of things out there on the network. It's amazing what's going on. So from our perspective, it goes back to the question that you had. It's educating our people and training them to a higher standard than the adversary. Go ahead.
There is one thing that I will throw a rock, not at anyone in this room, but it is to the hubris of this administration. If there is one thing that I fault them greatest for, is the idea that the rules that we make up for ourselves and that we break for ourselves won't be used against us. And perhaps, and certainly the point you raise around cyber attacks on other countries. We read them in the newspapers. I don't have the clearance, so I can't comment on it. But I can comment on the very same issue on drones. When this government uses unmanned aircraft to attack American citizens, not in the theaters of war, and the Chinese are not far behind us. When I go to conferences in Ditchley, this kind of North American NATO get-together where people off the record afterwards, it's the Brits, the Germans, the Italians, who are all worried because they know that the Chinese and the Russians are not far behind in development of drones. And how are we going to tell Putin or the Chinese not to use these unmanned attack vehicles when they want to go after the Chechens or the Tibetans? It's really going to be a problem. And so that's why I think that the irony of some of these technologies that we will employ will come back to haunt us.
Because I'm a broadcaster, I'm compelled to cut it off here. We could do another hour just on this discussion, I think, this last bit here. We're going to do what's basically a lightning round at the end, according to Wilson Center tradition. I'm just going to go right across this panel and give you each a couple of sentences, a final thought to take away here. Go ahead.
I think this is a big problem that we have. We need to educate the American people, government, Congress, everyone on that problem. We need a team approach, and it takes all of government to help solve it, working with industry, academia, and our allies.
Senator Collins.
In all the years that I've been working on homeland security issues, I can't think of another area where the threat is greater and we've done less.
Jane Harman.
I think no one should sit out this election, even if you are sick of it in the last 37 days. And I think no one should pass up the important opportunity to get into this debate and help us fashion the right policy.
Anthony Romero, you get the last word.
And I think we never need to sacrifice our civil liberties in the name of national security. If you have national security without civil liberties, you can have a dictatorship or a totalitarian regime. If you have safety without freedom, then you also have an anarchy. And if you have freedom without safety, then who wants to live in that type of country where you can be free, but you can't really live a wonderful, productive, healthy life? And so that's why you need both safety and freedom.
Okay, I feel like we've just begun the discussion, but thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you.